I'm Sophia, 28 years old, and I never thought my own family would humiliate me in front of an entire five-star hotel lobby. There I was, standing in the marble-floored Ritz-Carlton entrance, my designer luggage scattered around my feet after my sister Clarissa had just shoved me hard enough to send me stumbling. The sound of my parents' laughter echoed through the pristine space as wealthy guests turned to stare at the spectacle. But the real shock came when I discovered they had booked Clarissa her own presidential suite while expecting me to sleep on the living room sofa, despite the fact that I had paid for this entire $15,000 vacation myself. Before I dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about family drama that will leave you speechless. Trust me, what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty. Now, let me take you back to how this nightmare vacation began and why I decided to leave them all stranded without a way home. Let me paint you the picture of how this disaster started. For 2 solid years, I had been working 80 hours a week at my marketing firm, saving every penny I could spare for what I thought would be the perfect family vacation. I had dreamed of taking my parents and sister somewhere beautiful, somewhere we could finally bond and create those precious memories that seem to come so easily to other families. Hawaii felt like the perfect destination, and at $15,000 for flights, hotels, and activities, it represented the biggest financial commitment I had ever made for anyone other than myself. My father Robert, 55 years old and unemployed for 3 years running, had been struggling to find work in his field. My mother Linda, 52, worked part-time as a cashier at our local grocery store, bringing home barely enough to cover their basic expenses. Then there was Clarissa, my 25-year-old sister, who spent her days trying to become an influencer with zero income to show for her efforts. I genuinely believed this vacation would be my gift to them, a chance to show them how much I loved and appreciated them despite the financial strain they had put on me over the years. I had covered their mortgage payments during Dad's unemployment, helped with medical bills, and even paid for Clarissa's car repairs more times than I could count. This trip felt like the culmination of all my hard work and success, my way of saying thank you for raising me and supporting my dreams. The irony of that sentiment would become painfully clear before we even reached our destination. The first sign of trouble came at the airport, where I had carefully arranged our boarding passes and seat assignments months in advance. I had booked us all in economy class, which was already a stretch for my budget, but I wanted us to sit together and enjoy the journey as a family. When we arrived at the gate, Clarissa was practically bouncing with excitement, but not for the reasons I expected. She pulled out her phone and showed me something that made my blood run cold. Somehow, she had been upgraded to business class using frequent flyer miles that belonged to me. Miles I had earned through years of work travel, miles I had been saving for a special occasion, had been transferred to her account without my knowledge or permission. When I confronted my parents about this, expecting them to be just as shocked and upset as I was, their response left me speechless. Dad actually rolled his eyes and told me I was being selfish, that family meant sharing everything we had with each other. Mom chimed in with her favorite manipulation tactic, sighing dramatically and saying that I should be happy my sister was getting to experience something nice for once. But the real knife to my heart came when Clarissa boarded the plane and immediately began chatting with the passengers around her. From my economy seat, I could hear her animated voice carrying through the thin curtain that separated our sections. She was telling anyone who would listen about how she had saved up for this incredible vacation to Hawaii, how she had worked so hard to treat her family to something special. She painted herself as the generous sister, the successful one who could afford luxury travel, while describing me as her lucky sibling who got to tag along on her generosity. The flight attendants fawned over her story, and I watched through the gap in the curtain as she posed for selfies and soaked up all the attention that should have belonged to the person who actually paid for the trip. By the time we landed in Honolulu, I was already feeling the sting of being erased from my own vacation narrative, but I tried to push those negative feelings aside. This was supposed to be about family bonding, and I didn't want to start our trip on a sour note. I told myself that maybe my parents were just excited for Clarissa and hadn't thought through the implications of their actions. Maybe once we got to the hotel and settled in, things would return to normal and we could finally enjoy the vacation I had worked so hard to provide. The Ritz-Carlton Kapalua stood before us like something out of a magazine, its tropical luxury evident in every detail from the koa wood accents to the stunning ocean views that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. This was the moment I had been dreaming about, walking into paradise with my family and seeing their faces light up with joy and gratitude. Instead, what followed was a systematic dismantling of every expectation I had for this trip. The check-in process should have been straightforward since I had made all the reservations months in advance and had everything organized down to the smallest detail. However, as we approached the front desk, I noticed my parents exchanging meaningful glances and Clarissa smirking in a way that made my stomach twist with anxiety. The hotel manager, a polished woman in her 40s with a professional smile, greeted us warmly and began processing our reservations. That's when the first bombshell dropped. Apparently, there had been some changes made to our room arrangements, changes that nobody had bothered to discuss with me despite the fact that I was paying for everything. Clarissa had been moved to the presidential suite, a palatial space with panoramic ocean views, a private balcony, and amenities that cost more per night than most people made in a month. My parents had upgraded themselves to a deluxe room with a partial ocean view and a spacious layout that would allow them to relax in comfort. And me? I had been relegated to a standard room that overlooked the parking lot, barely larger than a closet and lacking any of the luxury features that made this hotel special. When I questioned this arrangement, my father's response was swift and dismissive. He told me that Clarissa needed the space for her content creation, that she was working during this vacation by documenting our trip for her social media followers. My mother added that they deserved a nice room after all the stress they had been under lately, and that I should be understanding about their needs. The hotel manager looked uncomfortable during this family discussion, clearly sensing the tension but professional enough to stay neutral. What she told me next, however, made my head spin with disbelief and anger. All additional charges for the rooms, including room service, spa treatments, and any other amenities, had been pre-authorized to my credit card. This meant that my family could essentially order anything they wanted without any spending limits, and the bills would automatically appear on my account. Before I could fully process this financial ambush, Clarissa had already begun taking advantage of her new arrangement. The presidential suite came with a complimentary champagne service, but apparently that wasn't good enough for her standards. She had ordered multiple bottles of Dom Perignon at $500 each, along with an elaborate cheese and caviar spread that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. Her spa appointment for the next day included a full-body massage, facial, manicure, pedicure, and some kind of gold leaf treatment that totaled over $2,000. The room service charges from just her first few hours in the suite exceeded $800, and we hadn't even been at the hotel for a full day yet. That afternoon, the hotel was hosting a poolside party for guests, complete with live music, tropical cocktails, and an atmosphere of relaxed luxury. I had been looking forward to this event as a chance for our family to mingle with other travelers and enjoy the social aspect of our vacation. Instead, it became another opportunity for my sister to rewrite history and cast herself as the star of our family dynamic. As we mingled with other guests around the infinity pool, Clarissa introduced me repeatedly as her personal assistant, someone she had brought along to help manage her busy schedule and handle the logistics of her vacation. The wealthy retirees and successful business people we met seemed impressed by her apparent success and sophistication, while I stood awkwardly beside her feeling more like hired help than a family member. The breaking point came when we were walking through the hotel lobby after the pool party, our group chatting and laughing as we made our way toward the elevators. The lobby was bustling with activity, guests checking in and out, staff members gliding efficiently between their tasks, and the general energy of a high-end resort in full swing. Clarissa had been talking animatedly about her plans for the next day, waving her hands around as she described the various activities she wanted to try. Then, either by accident or design, she bumped into me with enough force to send me stumbling toward one of the decorative water features that served as the centerpiece of the lobby. The splash was enormous and echoed through the marble space like a gunshot. I found myself waist-deep in ornamental water, completely soaked in my white designer sundress that I had specifically bought for this trip. The crystal clear water was cold against my skin, and I could feel my carefully styled hair dripping down my back as I struggled to maintain what little dignity I had left. But what hurt more than the physical embarrassment was the sound that followed. My parents burst into laughter, the kind of genuine, hearty laughter that I hadn't heard from them in years. They thought my humiliation was absolutely hilarious, and they weren't making any effort to hide their amusement from the crowd of strangers who had gathered to witness my mortification. Dad actually doubled over with laughter, pointing at me as if I were the punchline to the world's funniest joke. Mom had tears streaming down her face from laughing so hard, and she kept saying things like, "Sophia is always so clumsy and she never watches where she's going." Meanwhile, Clarissa stood there with a satisfied smile on her face, accepting the concerned attention from other guests who were asking if she was okay and whether her clumsy sister had hurt her during the incident. Hotel staff rushed over with towels and apologies, treating me with professional courtesy while my own family continued to treat my accident as entertainment. As I dripped my way toward the elevator, leaving a trail of water across the pristine marble floor, I realized that this vacation was not going to be the bonding experience I had envisioned. That evening, after I had changed into dry clothes and spent an hour trying to salvage my appearance, I knew I needed to have a serious conversation with my parents about what was happening on this trip. The financial arrangements, the room assignments, and especially the way they were treating me in public had crossed every line of acceptable family behavior. I found them in their deluxe room, lounging on the private balcony with glasses of expensive wine that had undoubtedly been charged to my credit card. The ocean view from their balcony was breathtaking, with the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, but I wasn't there to admire the scenery. I needed answers, and I needed them to understand that their behavior was completely unacceptable. When I started explaining my concerns about the vacation arrangements, my father's response was immediate and dismissive in a way that caught me completely off guard. Robert had always been skilled at turning conversations around on me, but this was manipulation on a level I had never experienced before. He told me I was being dramatic and oversensitive, that I was looking for problems where none existed because I couldn't handle seeing other people be happy. According to him, family members were supposed to support each other unconditionally, and my complaints about money and arrangements proved that I didn't understand what real family meant. He painted my concerns as selfishness and suggested that I had some kind of psychological issue that made me incapable of genuine generosity. My mother's approach was different but equally devastating. Linda had perfected the art of manipulative tears over the years, and she deployed them with surgical precision during our conversation. As I explained how hurt I felt by their treatment of me, she began crying softly and saying that she had obviously failed as a mother if I could be so cruel to my own family. She told me that she raised me to be kind and giving, not the selfish person I had apparently become. According to her, Clarissa was going through a difficult time in her life, struggling to build her career and find her place in the world, and I should be supporting her dreams instead of counting every dollar I spent on family happiness. The emotional manipulation was so skillfully done that I actually found myself apologizing for bringing up my concerns. But the third betrayal cut deeper than any financial manipulation or public humiliation could. During our conversation, my parents revealed information that completely recontextualized everything I thought I knew about my family's financial situation and future plans. Over the past few months, while I had been working myself to exhaustion and saving money for this vacation, they had been making arrangements to transfer ownership of several family assets directly to Clarissa. This included the family home where I had grown up, a small rental property that had been in our family for decades, and even some investments that I had always assumed would be shared between my sister and me eventually. Their reasoning was that Clarissa needed security and stability to pursue her influencer career, while I was obviously successful enough to take care of myself. The conversation took an even darker turn when Clarissa herself appeared in the doorway, having apparently been listening from the hallway. Her contribution to the discussion revealed a level of calculated manipulation that I never could have imagined from my own sister. She calmly informed me that if I continued to make trouble during this vacation or caused problems for the family going forward, she would have no choice but to tell people about my true character. According to her, I had been emotionally abusive to her for years, constantly putting her down and making her feel inferior because of my professional success. She had been documenting these instances of abuse, she claimed, and wouldn't hesitate to share her story with her social media followers, our extended family, and anyone else who would listen. The threat was delivered with such casual confidence that it took my breath away. Clarissa had apparently been building a narrative about our relationship that painted me as the villain and her as the long-suffering victim. She had posts ready to go on her social media accounts that would tell the story of growing up with an abusive older sister who used money and success to control and manipulate the family. She had conversations recorded on her phone that had been edited to remove context and make me sound cruel and demanding. Most devastatingly, she had convinced our parents that this version of events was true, that I really was the problem in our family dynamic and that they needed to protect her from my influence. As I sat in that hotel room, listening to my family systematically tear apart my character and rewrite the history of our relationships, I began to doubt my own perception of reality. Maybe I was too demanding when it came to money. Maybe I did expect too much gratitude for the financial support I provided. Maybe my success had made me arrogant and blind to my family's emotional needs. The gaslighting was so thorough and so skillfully executed that I started to wonder if I was the one with the problem, if my hurt feelings and financial concerns were really just symptoms of some deeper character flaw that I couldn't see in myself. The next evening brought what I had hoped would be a peaceful family dinner at the hotel's 5-star restaurant, a beautiful oceanfront establishment where I had made reservations months in advance. The restaurant was the kind of place where every detail spoke of understated luxury, from the hand-blown glass lighting fixtures to the locally sourced ingredients that were transformed into culinary masterpieces by the award-winning chef. I had been looking forward to this dinner as an opportunity for our family to enjoy a sophisticated meal together and perhaps repair some of the damage that had been done to our relationships over the past few days. Instead, it became the stage for the most humiliating experience of my entire life. Clarissa arrived at dinner dressed in a stunning designer gown that I later discovered cost more than my monthly salary, charged naturally to my credit card without any consultation or approval. She had spent the afternoon at the hotel spa getting her hair and makeup professionally done, another expense that had been automatically authorized to my account. Throughout the meal, she made a show of ordering the most expensive items on the menu, including wine pairings that cost more per glass than most people spend on an entire meal. She insisted on ordering for the entire table, selecting dishes and beverages with the confidence of someone who had never had to worry about the financial consequences of her choices. Everything might have remained merely expensive rather than devastating if not for what happened during the main course. I was wearing a white dress that I had bought specifically for this dinner, a beautiful piece that had cost me $400 and made me feel elegant and confident. As Clarissa gestured dramatically while telling one of her stories, she somehow managed to knock over her glass of red wine, sending the dark liquid cascading directly onto my lap and ruining the dress completely. The stain spread across the white fabric like blood, and I knew immediately that the dress was beyond salvation. What should have been a simple accident became something much more sinister when I caught the expression on Clarissa's face in the moment after the spill. There was a flash of satisfaction in her eyes, a quick smile that she suppressed almost immediately before launching into an elaborate apology performance. She made a tremendous show of being horrified by the accident, dabbing at my dress with her napkin while apologizing profusely and loudly enough for nearby tables to hear every word. According to her version of events, told to the increasingly interested audience of fellow diners, she was just trying to share an exciting story with her beloved sister when her natural enthusiasm got the better of her coordination. She painted herself as devastated by the accident and me as incredibly understanding and forgiving, even as I sat there dripping wine and struggling to process what had just happened. My parents' reaction to this incident revealed just how completely they had bought into Clarissa's narrative about our family dynamic. Instead of showing concern for my ruined dress or offering to help with the cleaning expenses, they immediately scolded me for overreacting to what they called a simple accident. Dad told me I was making a scene over nothing, while Mom suggested that perhaps I was being overly sensitive because I was tired from all the vacation activities. Their response made it clear that no matter what Clarissa did to me, they would find a way to make it my fault for not handling the situation with sufficient grace and understanding. The final humiliation of the evening came when we returned to the hotel lobby after dinner. The space was busy with guests returning from various activities, families gathering for evening entertainment, and the general bustle of a luxury resort in full swing. I was walking slightly ahead of my family, still embarrassed by my stained dress and eager to get to my room where I could change clothes and process the events of the evening. That's when Clarissa decided to make her grand finale move. She called out my name loudly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear, and when I turned around, she began speaking in a voice that carried clearly across the marble space. According to Clarissa's announcement, I was being a poor sport about the family vacation and couldn't handle the normal give and take of family bonding. She told the assembled crowd that she had tried everything she could think of to help me enjoy our trip, but I seemed determined to find fault with every arrangement and activity they planned. Her voice carried just the right note of concern and disappointment, making her sound like a loving sister who was genuinely worried about my emotional state. The performance was so convincing that several other guests nodded sympathetically and shot disapproving looks in my direction. Then came the physical culmination of her psychological assault. As I stood there in my stained dress, humiliated and confused by her public character assassination, Clarissa walked up to me with what appeared to be sisterly affection. She reached out as if she was going to give me a comforting hug, but instead gave me a hard shove that sent me stumbling backward across the polished marble floor. I nearly fell completely, only managing to catch myself at the last second by grabbing onto a nearby pillar. The push was hard enough to be clearly intentional but could easily be interpreted as an overly enthusiastic gesture that had accidentally gotten out of hand. Several people in the lobby actually started laughing, thinking they had witnessed a playful interaction between sisters rather than an act of calculated aggression. My parents' reaction was the final nail in the coffin of any remaining respect I had for them as human beings. They burst into the same kind of genuine laughter I had heard when I fell into the water feature, treating my humiliation as entertainment and my obvious distress as comedy. Other hotel guests began taking out their phones to record what they assumed was a funny family moment, and I realized that this experience would likely end up on social media as content for strangers to laugh at. As I stood there in the middle of that beautiful lobby, soaked in wine, physically assaulted by my sister, and laughed at by my parents while strangers recorded my humiliation, something fundamental shifted inside me. The family I had loved and supported and sacrificed for had shown me exactly what they thought I was worth. Standing in that hotel lobby, dripping with wine and surrounded by the laughter of my own family, I experienced what I can only describe as a moment of absolute clarity. For the first time in my adult life, I saw my family relationships for what they truly were rather than what I had desperately wanted them to be. This wasn't a case of occasional thoughtlessness or temporary selfishness that could be overcome with patience and understanding. This was a pattern of systematic emotional and financial abuse that had been going on for years, and I had been too invested in maintaining the fantasy of a loving family to recognize it for what it was. As I walked back to my parking lot view room that night, ignoring the continued laughter and commentary from my relatives, my mind began working with a calculation and precision that surprised me. The first step in my mental transformation was acknowledging the full scope of how my family had been exploiting me over the years. This vacation was just the most recent and blatant example of a dynamic that had been building since I started my career. Every family emergency that required my financial intervention, every guilt trip about success and responsibility, every manipulation that painted my reasonable boundaries as selfish behavior had been part of a larger pattern. They had trained me to be their personal bank account, and I had been so eager to prove my love and maintain family harmony that I had allowed them to rewrite the rules of our relationships entirely. The vacation expenses, the credit card authorizations, the room arrangements, and the public humiliations were just the logical extension of a system that had been in place for years. But as I analyzed the situation more carefully, I realized that I held more power in this dynamic than I had initially understood. Every aspect of our vacation arrangements flowed through my accounts, my reservations, and my organizational efforts. My family had become so accustomed to my handling all the logistics and finances that they had never developed backup plans or alternative resources. The rental car was in my name, booked with my credit card and my driver's license. The hotel reservations, despite the unauthorized changes, were still ultimately tied to my account and my contact information. Most importantly, all of their access to money and resources during this trip was dependent on my continued cooperation and financial authorization. My moment of strategic inspiration came when I remembered my conversation earlier that day with Marcus, the hotel concierge who had been helping coordinate some of our activity bookings. Marcus was a professional man in his 40s who had worked in luxury hospitality for over 20 years, and he had developed a keen eye for reading guest dynamics and family tensions. During our interaction, he had been politely professional, but I could sense that he had observed some of the tension in our group. When I thought back to our conversation, I remembered several subtle comments he had made that suggested he was well aware of how my family was treating me. More importantly, he had mentioned in passing that the hotel staff had received several complaints about me from my own family members. The next morning, I sought out Marcus during his shift and asked him directly about the complaints that had been filed. What he told me was both shocking and illuminating in ways that crystallized my understanding of just how calculated my family's behavior had become. According to Marcus, my parents and sister had approached various staff members over the past few days to express concerns about my mental state and behavior. They had described me as controlling, demanding, and emotionally unstable, suggesting that I was making the vacation difficult for everyone and that the staff should be prepared for potential outbursts or unreasonable demands from me. They had painted themselves as concerned family members trying to manage a difficult relative, setting up a narrative that would excuse any conflict or drama that might emerge during our stay. This revelation gave me the final piece of information I needed to understand that my family's behavior wasn't impulsive or emotional but rather carefully planned and systematically executed. They had anticipated that I might eventually object to their treatment and had preemptively poisoned the well with hotel staff to ensure that any complaints from me would be dismissed as the rantings of someone with psychological problems. The sophistication of their manipulation was breathtaking, and it made me realize that I was dealing with people who had been planning this level of exploitation for much longer than I had imagined. If they could be this calculated and strategic in their abuse, then I could certainly match their energy when it came to protecting myself. That evening, I began developing a plan that would use their own dependency against them while exposing the reality of our family dynamic to anyone who cared to observe. The beauty of my situation was that their complete reliance on my financial support and organizational abilities meant they had made themselves incredibly vulnerable to exactly the kind of abandonment they had been inflicting on me emotionally. They wanted to treat me like hired help rather than family? Perfect. Hired help could quit without notice and leave their employers to figure out their own arrangements. They wanted to drain my resources and then laugh at my distress? Excellent. I would simply remove their access to those resources and see how funny they found the situation when they were the ones dealing with consequences. The plan I developed was elegantly simple and completely legal, which made it both satisfying and foolproof. I would systematically remove their access to all the vacation resources they had been taking for granted, cancel any arrangements that were costing me money without providing me benefit, and then physically remove myself from this situation before they could mount any kind of coordinated response. By the time they realized what was happening, I would be beyond their reach and they would be left to experience firsthand what it felt like to be abandoned and humiliated by people they had trusted. The only difference was that their consequences would be the direct result of their own choices rather than the random cruelty they had been inflicting on me. I woke up at 5 a.m. on our 4th day in Hawaii, my mind clear and my resolve stronger than it had ever been in my entire life. The early hour meant the hotel was still mostly quiet, with only a few joggers and early morning swimmers taking advantage of the peaceful atmosphere. This timing was perfect for what I needed to accomplish, because I wanted to complete the first phase of my plan before my family had even gotten out of bed. My first stop was the front desk, where I spoke with the night manager about making some changes to our reservation arrangements. The conversation was professional and straightforward, focusing on my rights as the primary account holder to modify services and authorizations that had been set up under my name and credit card. The hotel staff was incredibly accommodating when I explained that I needed to cancel several services and modify the payment arrangements for the rooms. Since everything was ultimately booked under my name and credit card, I had complete authority to make whatever changes I deemed necessary. I canceled all of Clarissa's spa appointments for the remainder of our stay, voided the room service authorizations for both my parents' room and her suite, and removed the automatic charging privileges that had allowed them to order anything they wanted without prior approval. I also canceled the late checkout arrangements they had requested, meaning they would need to vacate their rooms by the standard 11 o'clock deadline rather than the luxurious 3 o'clock departure they had been planning. But the most significant change I made was to our departure arrangements. Originally, I had booked our return flights for Sunday afternoon, giving us a full week to enjoy the resort and all of its amenities. However, the airline had a flexible booking policy that allowed me to change our departure date with only a minimal fee, and I decided to take advantage of that option in a way that would maximize the impact of my plan. I moved my own flight to Saturday morning, a full day earlier than scheduled, while leaving my family's flights exactly as they were. This meant that they would have an extra 24 hours in Hawaii, which might sound like a gift until you consider that they would be spending those hours without access to the rental car, without any means of transportation to the airport, and without any authorized way to pay for additional services or accommodations. The rental car situation was perhaps the most elegant aspect of my entire plan. The vehicle had been booked exclusively under my name and driver's license, with my credit card as the sole authorized payment method. This meant that I could simply take possession of the car and leave whenever I chose, without any requirement to coordinate with my family or ensure their transportation needs were met. They had spent the entire vacation treating me like their personal chauffeur and logistics coordinator, apparently never considering what would happen if I decided to stop providing those services. When I retrieved the car keys from my hotel room that morning, I felt a sense of power and control that had been missing from my life for years. The next phase of my plan involved ensuring that my family would face immediate consequences for their behavior rather than having time to develop countermeasures or find alternative solutions to their problems. I visited the hotel's business center and spent 30 minutes canceling or modifying every service and reservation that was costing me money without providing me direct benefit. This included restaurant reservations I had made for family dinners, activity bookings for snorkeling and hiking excursions, and even the champagne service that had been delivering expensive bottles to Clarissa's suite every evening. By the time I finished with these cancellations, my family would wake up to discover that their entire vacation infrastructure had evaporated overnight. The first indication that my plan was working came around 9 o'clock that morning, when Clarissa called the front desk in a panic because her spa appointment had been cancelled and the staff was refusing to reschedule her without advance payment. According to the front desk agent who later filled me in on the conversation, Clarissa had become increasingly hysterical as she realized that her access to hotel services had been completely cut off. She had tried to authorize new charges using her own credit card, but apparently her personal finances couldn't support the kind of luxury lifestyle she had been enjoying at my expense. The conversation had escalated to the point where hotel security was called to address what they described as a disturbance in the presidential suite. My parents' reaction was equally dramatic but took a different form. When they discovered that their room service breakfast had been cancelled and they couldn't order replacements without providing payment information, they immediately began calling my room to demand an explanation. I let their calls go to voicemail, where they left increasingly frantic messages that revealed just how completely they had come to depend on my financial support and organizational efforts. By the third message, my father was no longer trying to maintain his usual manipulative calm and was simply shouting threats and demands into the phone. My mother's messages were more emotionally manipulative, featuring the same kind of tears and guilt trips she had used throughout my childhood, but with a new note of genuine panic that suggested she was beginning to understand the seriousness of their situation. The most satisfying moment of the morning came when I was checking out at the front desk and overheard Clarissa having a complete meltdown in the lobby. She had apparently stormed down from her suite in her pajamas, demanding to speak with the hotel manager about the unauthorized changes to their reservations. Her voice was loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear as she insisted that there had been some kind of mistake, that she was a valued guest who deserved better treatment, and that someone needed to fix these problems immediately. The hotel staff remained professional throughout her outburst, but it was clear that they were treating her as exactly what she was, a difficult guest who was making unreasonable demands without any ability to pay for the services she expected. What made the scene even more perfect was the presence of other hotel guests who had witnessed our family interactions over the past few days. These were the same people who had seen my parents laughing at my humiliation, who had watched Clarissa push me in the lobby, who had been audience to all the little cruelties and manipulations that had been inflicted on me throughout the vacation. Now they were seeing the other side of the story, watching my family members reveal their true characters when they no longer had access to the resources and services they had been taking for granted. The contrast between their previous arrogance and their current panic was stark enough that several guests were clearly enjoying the show, and I realized that my family was finally experiencing the kind of public humiliation they had been so eager to inflict on me. Part 8. Final battle and truth revealed ****. Just as I was completing my checkout process and preparing to leave for the airport, my family managed to track me down in the hotel lobby. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything that had ever happened in our family before, because for the first time in my life, they were the ones who needed something from me rather than the other way around. The dynamic shift was immediately apparent in their body language and tone of voice. Gone was the casual dismissiveness and manipulative confidence they had displayed throughout the vacation. Instead, they approached me with a combination of anger and desperation that revealed just how completely their comfortable assumptions about our relationship had been shattered. Clarissa was the first to launch into an attack, but her usual arsenal of emotional manipulation and social pressure had lost its effectiveness now that I held all the cards in our situation. She threatened to destroy my reputation on social media, promising to tell all her followers about what an abusive and controlling sister I was, how I had abandoned my family in their time of need, and how I had used money as a weapon to hurt people who loved me. But her threats rang hollow because she was delivering them while standing in a hotel lobby in her pajamas, having just thrown a public tantrum that had been witnessed by dozens of strangers. The contrast between her claims of being a successful influencer and the reality of her current situation made her threats seem more pathetic than frightening. My father tried to regain control of the situation by reverting to his usual intimidation tactics, raising his voice and attempting to shame me into compliance through sheer force of personality. He told me that I was making the biggest mistake of my life, that family was forever and I would regret destroying these relationships over something as trivial as money and vacation arrangements. He threatened to cut me out of the family will, apparently forgetting that I had already discovered there were no assets left for me to inherit since everything had been transferred to Clarissa already. His anger was real and intense, but it was the anger of someone who had lost control of a situation he had always been able to manipulate, and his desperation was becoming more obvious with every word he spoke. My mother's approach was more calculated but equally ineffective given the new reality of our situation. She suddenly developed what appeared to be heart palpitations, clutching her chest and breathing heavily while claiming that the stress of the situation was affecting her health. This was a manipulation tactic she had used successfully throughout my childhood, and I had to admit it was still effective at triggering my instinctive caretaking responses. But I had learned enough about her patterns over the years to recognize the performance for what it was, and I also knew that giving in to this particular manipulation would only reset our dynamic back to the destructive pattern that had brought us to this point. The turning point in our confrontation came when I decided to stop defending myself and start going on the offensive instead. For the first time in our family history, I began systematically calling out the years of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and systematic exploitation that had characterized our relationships. I had documentation on my phone showing every family emergency I had paid for, every guilt trip that had been used to extract money from me, every instance where my success had been minimized while my resources were maximized. The numbers were staggering when laid out in sequence: tens of thousands of dollars over the years, countless hours of emotional labor, and a pattern of treatment that would be considered abusive if it were happening between strangers rather than family members. What made this conversation different from every previous family conflict was the presence of witnesses who could observe our interaction without the emotional investment that had always clouded my judgment. Other hotel guests had stopped to watch our confrontation, drawn by the volume and intensity of our voices, and I could see in their faces that they were understanding exactly what kind of family dynamic was being revealed. These strangers could see what I had been unable to recognize for years: that I was dealing with people who viewed me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be loved and respected. Their reactions gave me the external validation I needed to trust my own perceptions of the situation. The final revelation came when Clarissa's social media facade began crumbling in real time. Several of her followers had apparently seen her live streams and posts from our vacation and had started asking pointed questions about the discrepancies in her stories. Comments on her posts were pointing out that she had claimed to be paying for the vacation while also posting about spa treatments and luxury experiences that seemed beyond her apparent means. Other users had started investigating her background and discovering that most of her success stories were fabricated or exaggerated. As we stood in that lobby arguing, her phone kept buzzing with notifications from social media platforms, and each notification seemed to make her more desperate and aggressive. The coup de grace came when my cousin Michelle, who had been following our vacation through my sister's social media posts, called me directly to find out what was really happening. Michelle had always been more observant than the rest of our extended family, and she had noticed inconsistencies in Clarissa's stories that raised questions about our family's financial arrangements and relationship dynamics. When I put the call on speakerphone so that everyone could hear the conversation, Michelle revealed that she and other family members had been discussing their concerns about how my parents and sister had been treating me for years. According to Michelle, there had been multiple conversations among aunts, uncles, and cousins about my family's apparent financial dependence on me and the way they seemed to take my support for granted while offering nothing in return. This revelation completely undermined my family's attempts to paint me as the villain in our relationship dynamics. Here was an objective third party who had been observing our situation from the outside and had reached the same conclusions I was just beginning to articulate for myself. Michelle's perspective gave me the confidence to stop apologizing for my actions and start demanding accountability for theirs. By the time our confrontation ended, it was clear to everyone present, including my family members themselves, that their version of events didn't match the observable reality of our relationships. Walking through the airport toward my gate that morning felt like emerging from a psychological prison that I hadn't even realized I was trapped in. For the first time in years, I was traveling without the weight of family obligations and expectations pressing down on my shoulders. Every step toward my departure gate took me further away from the toxicity that had been poisoning my life, and I found myself experiencing a sense of lightness and freedom that I had forgotten was possible. The relief was so profound that I actually started crying in the middle of the terminal, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that I had finally broken free from a cycle of abuse that had been defining my adult life. The immediate consequences of my actions began unfolding even before my plane left Hawaiian airspace. My family's situation at the resort became increasingly desperate as they realized that I had not only removed their access to money and transportation but had also eliminated their ability to extend their stay or modify their arrangements without significant financial resources of their own. According to the updates I received from hotel staff over the following days, they were forced to call various extended family members to ask for emergency financial assistance and travel arrangements. These conversations apparently did not go well, because most of our relatives had already heard Michelle's version of events and were not particularly sympathetic to my family's sudden crisis. The social media fallout was perhaps even more devastating than their immediate financial difficulties. Clarissa's followers had continued investigating her background and vacation claims, and the discrepancies they discovered had started a viral thread about influencer fraud and family exploitation. Screenshots of her posts claiming to have paid for our Hawaii vacation were being compared with public records showing that all the hotel and travel arrangements were linked to my name and credit cards. The investigative work of her own followers had essentially exposed her entire social media persona as a fabrication built on other people's money and success. Within a week of our vacation, she had lost over 60% of her followers and had been dropped by the few small brands that had been considering sponsorship deals. My parents' consequences were more practical but equally significant. With their primary source of emergency financial support suddenly unavailable, they were forced to confront the reality of their own financial situation for the first time in years. Dad had to accept a job that he had previously considered beneath his qualifications, while Mom had to increase her hours at the grocery store to help cover their basic expenses. The rental property they had planned to transfer to Clarissa was suddenly back on the table as a potential source of income, because they needed every financial resource they could access to maintain their standard of living without my subsidies. But the most profound consequence was the way our extended family's perception of our relationships had shifted. Michelle had shared our conversation with other relatives, and the story had spread through our family network much more quickly than I had expected. Aunts and uncles who had always praised my parents for raising such a successful daughter were now asking pointed questions about how that success had been leveraged to support the rest of the family. Cousins who had admired Clarissa's apparent lifestyle were now understanding that her luxury experiences had been funded by someone else's hard work. The family narrative that had always positioned me as the lucky one who should be grateful for my opportunities was being rewritten to acknowledge the reality of who was actually supporting whom. The support system that emerged from this revelation was one of the most unexpected and healing aspects of my entire experience. Relatives who had seemed distant or disinterested in my life suddenly reached out to express their support and share their own observations about my family's behavior over the years. Several cousins admitted that they had always felt uncomfortable with the way my parents talked about my success, describing it as luck rather than hard work and suggesting that I owed the family compensation for my good fortune. Others revealed that they had noticed the financial dynamic but hadn't felt comfortable commenting on what seemed like private family business. My professional life also began improving in ways that I hadn't anticipated. Without the constant stress of family financial emergencies and emotional manipulation, I found myself sleeping better, thinking more clearly, and performing at a higher level in my work. Colleagues noticed that I seemed more confident and decisive, and I started receiving recognition and opportunities that had been eluding me during the years when my personal life was consumed by family drama. The promotion I received 6 months after the Hawaii incident came with a salary increase that more than compensated for the money I was no longer spending on family support. 6 months after that transformative vacation in Hawaii, my life had been completely reconstructed around healthier boundaries and more authentic relationships. The process of rebuilding had not been easy, because untangling yourself from toxic family dynamics requires confronting years of conditioning and learned behaviors that feel like core parts of your identity. There were moments when I questioned my actions and wondered if I had been too harsh in my response to what could have been seen as typical family dysfunction. But each time those doubts surfaced, I reminded myself of how I had felt standing in that hotel lobby, soaked in wine and surrounded by the laughter of people who were supposed to love and protect me. The therapy sessions I began after returning from Hawaii helped me understand the full scope of what had been happening in my family relationships and why it had taken me so long to recognize the abuse for what it was. My therapist explained that financial abuse is one of the most common forms of family exploitation, particularly when one family member achieves significantly more success than the others. The guilt and obligation I had felt about sharing my success were normal responses that had been systematically manipulated and weaponized against me over a period of years. Learning to distinguish between genuine family support and exploitative manipulation became one of the most valuable skills I developed during this period of growth and healing. My family's attempts at reconciliation began approximately 3 months after our Hawaii disaster, once they had fully processed the reality of their new financial situation and the social consequences of their behavior. The initial approaches were tentative and focused primarily on testing whether I might be willing to resume some level of financial support for family emergencies. When those overtures were firmly declined, they shifted strategies and began focusing on emotional appeals about the importance of family forgiveness and the need to move past old conflicts for the sake of family unity. These conversations followed exactly the same patterns that had been used to manipulate me in the past, but my new understanding of their tactics made them ineffective. The most significant reconciliation attempt came in the form of an invitation to a family dinner where my parents promised to acknowledge their mistakes and work toward rebuilding our relationships on healthier foundations. I decided to attend this dinner, but with carefully established boundaries that included splitting all costs equally and limiting the conversation topics to avoid the emotional manipulation tactics they had used so effectively in the past. The dinner was awkward and stilted, but it served an important purpose in demonstrating that change was possible if everyone involved was willing to participate honestly and respectfully. That evening marked the beginning of a new phase in our family relationships, one characterized by limited contact, clear boundaries, and mutual respect for each other's autonomy. My parents gradually accepted that their financial independence was their own responsibility, while Clarissa was forced to develop actual job skills and income sources to support her lifestyle ambitions. Our interactions became more honest because the underlying power dynamic that had enabled manipulation and exploitation had been permanently altered. We would never have the close, warm family relationships I had dreamed of during my younger years, but we could have functional relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. The most profound lesson I learned from this experience was that love without respect is not actually love at all, but rather a form of emotional exploitation that benefits the receiver while harming the giver. Real family relationships require reciprocity, consideration, and genuine concern for each other's well-being. When family members consistently prioritize their own comfort and convenience over your emotional and financial well-being, they are demonstrating that they view you as a resource rather than a person. Recognizing this distinction and acting on it, even when doing so requires difficult choices and painful confrontations, is often the only way to preserve your own mental health and self-worth. The financial independence that came from cutting off family support allowed me to redirect my resources toward goals and experiences that actually brought me joy and satisfaction. I was able to build up my emergency savings, invest in my own future, and even take vacations where I could relax and enjoy myself without worrying about other people's expectations or ungrateful behavior. The contrast between my solo travels and that disastrous family vacation was stark enough to reinforce my understanding of how much my family's presence had been detracting from my own happiness and peace of mind. As I reflect on that pivotal moment in the Ritz-Carlton lobby, when I made the decision to walk away from people who had shown me exactly what they thought I was worth, I feel nothing but gratitude for having found the strength to choose myself over their comfort. That choice led to a complete transformation in how I approach relationships, boundaries, and self-worth that has improved every aspect of my life. Sometimes the greatest act of love you can perform is refusing to enable people who are using your love as a weapon against your own well-being. Family isn't just about blood connections or shared history. It's about respect, support, and genuine care for each other's happiness and success. Sometimes you have to lose a family to find yourself, and sometimes finding yourself means discovering that you deserve relationships built on mutual respect rather than one-sided exploitation. The people who truly love you will celebrate your boundaries rather than fighting against them, and they will add value to your life rather than constantly draining it. Now I'd love to hear from all of you watching this story. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family members were taking advantage of your success or generosity? How did you handle it, and what advice would you give to someone dealing with similar family dynamics? Please share your experiences in the comments below, because these stories help all of us recognize unhealthy patterns and find the courage to create positive changes in our own lives. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and make sure to subscribe for more real-life stories about family drama, personal growth, and learning to set boundaries with difficult people. If you found this story helpful, please share it with someone who might be dealing with similar family challenges. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that you deserve relationships that lift you up rather than tear you down. Until next time, keep standing up for yourself and never let anyone convince you that your worth is determined by what you can provide for others.